I see we still have folks filtering in, so we're going to give everybody another 2 minutes before we go ahead and get started. Okay. I want to be mindful of the time we've set aside for today. So we're about a minute after the hour. I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining PowerFlex's webinar today, Charging Ahead, Navigating 2024 EVSE Policies. I'm Annie Gala, your host for today. Our speakers are Raghav Murali, the Director of Policy and Government Affairs, and John Hart, our Senior Public Policy Manager at PowerFlex. PowerFlex is a clean tech solutions provider for commercial and industrial customers. This webinar is going to be recorded and will be emailed to attendees after the event. It'll also be added to our events center at powerflex.com later today. We plan on having this presentation run about 30 minutes, leaving 10 to 15 minutes at the end for attendee questions. The question function has been enabled for participants to submit questions through. We will address all of the questions at the end of the presentation. Thanks so much for taking time out of your day to join us. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Raghav and John.
Thanks, Annie, and good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you're at. Really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. Like Annie said, my name is Raghav Murali. I'm our Director of Policy and Government Affairs here at PowerFlex. And with me today is my colleague, John Hart, who is our Senior Public Policy Manager. And today our goal is to really talk through some of the high-level policy drivers, mandates, goals, and actually in particular building codes that are driving the growth of EVs and EV charging, or EVSE, as we'll use that acronym today, which stands for EV Service Equipment. And really, this is critically important for our sort of collective goal of combating climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It's certainly our goal here at PowerFlex. Mobile source emissions, which are emissions from vehicles, light duty, medium duty, and heavy duty vehicles, are actually the greatest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. And so this is critically important, and policymakers have adopted a lot of policies over the last couple of years and are still contemplating many more here in the coming months, which we fully support here at PowerFlex and are actually actively shaping many of them as we speak. However, we do recognize that this sort of complicated policy landscape can be a little difficult to navigate. And so our goal here is to, just at a high level in the 30 minutes that we have together, talk through some of those tentpole policies and really offer ourselves as a resource for you guys subsequent to this webinar to help out in any policy questions you may have or development questions. In terms of our agenda, I'll just spend a minute or two talking through who we are at PowerFlex. I know Annie kind of brought that up at the top, but I'll kind of expand on that a bit. We'll also talk through some of those EV and EVSE goals and mandates I mentioned that are really driving where the market is going. And then I'll hand it off to my colleague, John Hart, to talk through where really the battleground is occurring on EV charging development, which is the state building codes. Starting in California, which is sort of at the tip of the spear on all things EV and EV charging policy, and then expanding to the other states that have sort of followed in California's lead in adopting progressive building codes. Then we'll talk through some of the incentives, at least at an illustrative level, that can kind of help improve the economics of your EV charging projects. And then end with a description of how PowerFlex can help be a resource for you as you contemplate your own EV charging development. With that, we'll spend a minute talking about who we are here at PowerFlex, just to orient you. Ultimately, PowerFlex is a one-stop shop for your clean energy development needs. As Annie mentioned, we specialize in commercial and industrial solar storage and EV charging. So we operate in all of those distributed resource areas, and we do so at scale. According to Wood Mackenzie, which is a national research organization, we're number 2 in the country in commercial and industrial solar and have the 4th largest level 2 charging network in the United States of America. So in addition to our diversity in terms of the resource areas where we operate in, we also handle every aspect of a project development from soup to nuts. So we work with our clients to develop and design projects that are uniquely suited for their own priorities, geography, building types. We also handle the turnkey installation of those projects, which, because we handle everything all in-house here, we can do at fairly low cost. Even prior to the installation, we on the policy team and our sister team here at PowerFlex, the incentives team, endeavors to identify programs, grant funding opportunities, incentives, and rebates that we can sort of harness to reduce the cost of the overall project. And actually in-house, we'll manage or concierge the application and receipt of those incentives to, again, lower the cost of the project. In addition to installing the project, often we actually operate the project for the full life cycle of its existence to ensure that it's not just installed and just left alone, but rather installed and operated in a way that day to day, year over year, optimizes customer cost reduction, bill arbitrage, and of course, greenhouse gas reduction. Specifically on the EV charging side, we're the number 1 provider of large scale EV charging facilities, which means facilities that have over 30 EV chargers. And we have 10,000 charging stations operated in existence today. And I mentioned that we're specializing commercial and industrial. That has a fairly broad application. So commercial and industrial means, the big box retailers and distribution facilities like your Walmarts and your Amazons and your Targets. But we also work really closely with public center entities like the County of Los Angeles, City of Palo Alto, airports like the San Diego Airport, LAX, San Francisco Airport, healthcare facilities like multiple Kaiser facilities throughout California, and public sector entities like the County of Los Angeles. We also are increasingly specializing in multi-unit dwellings or apartment buildings and fleets as well. So now that you know a little bit more about PowerFlex and specifically our role in the EV charging market, why don't we touch on some of these EV and EVSE goals and mandates that are helping to drive the market before I hand things off to John to really get into the nitty-gritty. So at a very high level, the federal government has 2 EV and EV charging goals. It has a goal of 50% of new ZEV, and that stands for zero emission vehicle sales, by 2030, as well as 500,000 public EV charging stations installed by 2030. California, meanwhile, the biggest market for EVs and EV chargers, has its own EVSE goal of 250,000 by the end of 2025. And there's a gap between now and then that we really have to fill. But beyond those goals, actually the biggest goal at the state level that's driving where the policy is headed on EVs and EV charging is Executive Order 97920, signed by Governor Gavin Newsom about 3.5 years ago. And what this goal did is it made California the very first state to actually ban internal combustion engine vehicles, in this case by 2035. Subsequent to 2035, all new vehicle sales in California for light-duty vehicles have to be zero emission vehicles. Just to kind of put things in perspective in terms of where things are at in the market today, last year in the United States, there were approximately 1.4 EV sales, which represented approximately 10% of the overall light-duty new sales market. In California, the sale number was 450,000 for zero-emission vehicle sales, which represented approximately 25% of all new vehicle sales. So obviously these numbers are great. They're the highest they've ever been, but they do represent a huge gap between where we need to be by 2035 per Governor Newsom's executive order. So in order to fill that gap, Governor Newsom, his administration, the state of California, has adopted 3 regulations that are really setting the tone for other states. The first is called the Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulation. And this creates a step down between now and 2035 to try to make sure that we're on pace to achieve the zero emission vehicle goal. In this case, by 2026, 35% of all new vehicle sales in California have to be ZEV. By 2030, 68% of all new vehicle sales in California need to be ZEV. And then finally, by 2035, per the executive order, 100% of those need to be ZEV. There's also the advanced clean trucks regulation. A lot of the conversation in the ZEV and EV charging space centers around light duty vehicles. Often when you think about EVs, you think about Teslas and those types of things. But actually, medium duty and heavy duty vehicles have an outsized impact on greenhouse gas emissions. So it's really important to tackle the truck market as well. And with this advanced clean truck regulation, it's seeking to do just that. It also creates a step down in the percentage of trucks, new trucks that are sold that must be zero emission vehicle trucks. Ultimately, by 2035, zero emission trucks need to be 55% of class 2B through 3 truck sales, 75% of class 4 through 8 straight truck sales, and 40% of truck tractor sales. And finally, in California, they passed a regulation called the Advanced Clean Fleets Regulation. And what this does is it requires manufacturers to sell only ZEV medium and heavy duty vehicles starting in the year 2036. And it also requires fleet owners to choose one of 2 options to electrify the next several years. First, they can commit to either purchasing only ZEV vehicles starting in 2024, and then beginning in 2025, phasing out their inventory of existing internal combustion engine vehicles at the end of those vehicles' useful lives. Or alternatively, they can elect to meet certain ZEV targets as a percentage of their total fleet according to the schedule that you see on the right-hand side of your screen here. There's 3 different milestone groups representing 3 different types of medium and heavy duty vehicles. The first are milestone group 1, which consists of box trucks, vans, buses with 2 axles, yard tractors, light duty package vehicles. And for that group, they have to have 10% of their vehicles be ZEV by 25, 25% by 28, 50% by 2031, 75% by 2033, and finally 100% by 2035. So for that milestone group, it moves the most rapidly. For milestone group 2, that includes work trucks, day cab tractors, and buses with 3 axles. For those, the milestones are 10% by 27, 25% by 2030, 50% by 2033, 75% by 2036, and finally 100% by 2039 and beyond. And finally, the last milestone group here for the Advanced Clean Fleets regulation is the sleeper cab tractors and specialty vehicles. And those you have to have 10% by 2030, 25% by 2033, 50% by 2036, 75% by 2039, and finally 100% by 2042. So that one is the most pushed out. And we here at PowerFlex have already been in receipt of calls from fleet operators who are trying to figure out which of these 2 options is best for them and really trying to navigate how to achieve this standard. So we encourage you to reach out to us. So just toggling back to the previous slide, I know this slide can feel fairly California centric, and I think there's some reason for that, given that 450,000 of the 1.4 EV sales in 23 did occur in California. And it's sort of on the tip of the spear and most proactive in terms of pursuing EV and EV charging policy. But before I hand it off to John, I just want to highlight one very important thing. 12 different states, including California, have already adopted California's clean cars, advanced clean cars, and advanced clean trucks rule. So in addition to California, we have Colorado, Delaware, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, Oregon, Rhode Island, Vermont, Virginia, and Washington that have already adopted these regulations. Advanced Clean Fleets is a little bit slower to adopt, but that's also being adopted and being pursued in multiple jurisdictions this year. We suspect that number of 12 to continue to grow between now and the end of 2024. So these policies enacted initially in California are being enacted throughout the country and are really dictating where things are going on the EV side of the house. On the EV charging side of the house, I'm going to hand it off to John to really get into the battleground of where this is happening right now, which is in our building codes, starting with California and then moving on to other states. Just want to highlight that the building codes world can be somewhat Byzantine and a little bit arcane. It can be hard to navigate, even for policy professionals like us. So it's really, really helpful for PowerFlex to have an expert in-house like John, who understands these and is able to sort of not only monitor them, but actively shape them. So with that, John, do you want to talk about where things are happening in the building codes?
Absolutely. Thanks, Raghav. Appreciate the intro and diving right into it. A quick little introduction to California's building codes. Uh, they impact all aspects. If you install solar, for example, then you know that all new residential C&I buildings need to have solar. They can have batteries to help supplement that requirement. There's energy efficiency requirements, and now there are starting to be electric vehicle charging requirements. These really fit into the parking lot requirements. And as part of building a new building and having parking lots, they are now beginning to have, the last several years have been requirements of the number of spaces that must have electric vehicle chargers installed, or at least be what they call EV capable or EV ready, and I'll describe more what those mean. The building code cycle is every 18 months, the building codes are updated. And it's really supposed to be every 3 years, there's more or less a major update. And then in between those 18 months in between are kind of minor adjustments. But even in those minor adjustment years, we will see changes that can be substantial. The reason I bring this up is just to give you a sense of the timing. The next round of building code requirements are coming into effect July 1st of this year. So in just about in a few months, these requirements will be in effect. And these are for all new buildings, or in this case, I'm going to be talking about parking lots that submit for a building request starting July 1st or after. So if you submit for a building request before then, you are subject to the building code requirements that are in effect right now. The codes that are coming into effect July 1st, there are a couple that are pretty substantial and important for building developers to be aware of, and have to do specifically with solar and EV charging. One of the big requirements is that for non-residential buildings and for multi-unit dwellings, if a site is installing a solar carport, so even if this is not for a brand new build, if it's an existing building, existing parking lot, but it is installing a solar carport, that now triggers this requirement of having a certain number or certain percentage of spaces that are EV charging spaces. There's a couple different definitions, just to go over these quickly. There's what the building code calls EV capable. EV capable spaces do not have an actual level 2 charger installed yet, and they do not even have the wiring to support that charger installed yet. Rather, they have the sub panel that would support the EV chargers, and the sub transformer are installed. The panel has enough space to support the level 2 chargers in the future. And conduit is run through the parking lot, either underground or above ground, however it works in that space. The conduit is run so that in the future you can run the wiring through it and you can install the charger. That's what they call EV capable. Then they have the level 2 charger. This is everything. You have the fully functional level 2 charger ready to go. For non-residential buildings, they're requiring that 15% of the spaces covered by the solar canopy. And I think that's an important distinction as well. It's not just the entire parking lot. If the solar canopy is really covering only a portion of those parking spaces, it's the number of spaces covered by the solar carport. 15% of those must be EV capable, where they have the panel space set aside and the conduit run to the parking spaces. And 5% of those must have the actual level 2 charger installed. So a total of 20% of the spaces will be either fully functional level 2 chargers or have the panel space for in the future to install those. For a multi-unit dwelling, 10% of the parking spaces impacted by the solar carport will have to be EV capable. They're not yet requiring that any actual level 2 chargers be installed, but I'm guessing with my crystal ball that in the future, that will change, that there will be a requirement for actual level 2 chargers to be installed, but that's not currently in place. Raghav, do you want to go to the next slide? Sorry, back one. I skipped one, so I didn't realize that we got. The other requirement coming into effect is for brand new parking lots. As of right now, there already are requirements for brand new parking lots and the number of EV chargers or EV capable. Those numbers are changing. They're increasing slightly depending on whether you're non-residential or multi-unit dwelling. And again, these changes will go into effect July 1st of this year. One more definition I want to bring up, low power level 2 receptacles. These are relevant for multi-unit dwellings. Specifically, these are essentially half of the power output of let's say a standard or a minimum what's required for level 2. It's a 20 amp rather than a 40 amp circuit, and then it ends in a receptacle. So not necessarily a level 2 charging station, but a receptacle that the vehicle could plug into that receptacle if you have the plug-in for it. The reason I bring that up is that for multi-unit dwellings in new parking lots, they're going to require that 40% of the parking spaces will be equipped with low power level 2 receptacles, and 10% will have regular level 2 chargers in them. So 50% of all parking spaces in new multi-unit dwellings will have to have some form of EV charging. It's also important to note that the low power level 2 requirement can be met with regular level 2 chargers, meaning that if you wanted to install all 50% with level 2 chargers, you could, or any percentage above 10%, between 10 and 50%, you could do with level 2 chargers, and the others with low power level 2. For non-residential buildings, same requirement with the solar canopy, where 15% must be EV capable and 5% must have level 2 chargers. So again, 20% of new parking spaces for non-residential buildings will be some form of either charger or EV capable. And then looking into the future, so I mentioned that this is really a 18-month cycle. So the next major code changes are going into effect January 1st, 2026. We do not yet know what those are. However, the Building Standards Commission, which is a makeup of 3 different agencies, is currently in the process of developing those requirements. They hold multiple workshops. They'll meet for several days with the Building Advisory Commission and develop these requirements. They do accept public input, and so we're able to participate in these and shape these, and also, if anything, get a view on what might be coming down the road. Now, again, these are not yet accepted, but they should be adopted by the Building Standards Commission by the end of this year, so that we have roughly a year to know what they are. Those draft requirements, or those requirements, will be drafted in July of 2025 with the actual building language. So we'll have 6 full months to know exactly what the codes will look like. What I'm expecting, as I mentioned before, is an increased number of percentages of EV charging stations, whether level 2, EV capable, low power level 2. I'm expecting kind of across the board those percentages to increase, to have higher requirements of some form of EV charging at both non-residential and multi-unit dwellings. That's a a really quick run through of California. This is much more nuanced as Raghav mentioned, and this is really kind of distilling the main points into kind of digestible tables and a digestible format. Within each of these requirements, there are exceptions and so forth. But I think one of the biggest takeaways is that the EV charging is becoming more of a requirement rather than a nice to have, especially with new builds. It's likely we will see changes as well with existing buildings as they are retrofitted needing to install EV charging. So something to be aware of and become familiar with, so that over the years, as these requirements increase, building companies, property owners will be ready for this change. With that, moving on to other states, this is a high-level overview. There are 7 other states outside of California that passed legislation this last year in 2023 that are now requiring some type of EV parking space for new construction, and some of them for retrofits as well. I think it's important to note as well that of these 7 states, 5 of them have already adopted the advanced clean cars, advanced clean trucks requirements. One of them, Illinois, is actively considering it, looking at it. And Hawaii, I will not be surprised if in the near future they adopt something similar as well. So with that, Colorado, legislation signed last year is requiring that beginning March 1st, so in just a few days, all new construction and major renovation. So again, this is for existing parking lots that are going through a major renovation, will be required to install a certain number of EV parking spaces. They have 4 different categories. 2 of them I've mentioned already, the EV installed space, that's with the full level 2. The EV capable is the same as in California, where you have the panel, transformer, and you run the conduit. There's another EV ready. This is where you, similarly with EV capable, you have the transformer panel, the conduit, but then you actually run the wiring through the conduit, and it ends at the parking space in either a junction box or a receptacle. And the intent there is you can come back in the future with the actual charging station and essentially plug it in, and now you have a fully functional level 2 charger. They have one more category, EV capable light. This is where, as with EV capable, you run the conduit from the panel or from where the panel would be to the parking spaces. EV capable light, however, you do not need to actually install the panel or the transformer. Rather, you need to set aside the physical space, meaning you might pour a pad and you need to block that off so that in the future you could install the transformer or the panel and run the wiring through the conduit from there. The requirements are for buildings with either 10 or more parking spaces. You have non-residential buildings that are requiring this combination of different types of EV capable, EV ready, EV charging stations. 30% of spaces will need to have some form of EV charging. Again, whether it's EV capable or the actual charger there. For multi-unit dwellings, they've doubled this to 60%. So again, for major renovations, new construction, looking at 30 to 60% of parking spaces having some form of EV charging. Moving on now to New York.
And before you do so, John, I'll add an interjection here on Colorado, is that these building code changes are actually the result of a bill that was signed by Governor Polis there. A bill that was actually essentially vetoed just a year prior. So it's just an indication of just how rapidly this market is transforming, even at the political level.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Raghav. I think it's a great point to see, even as I mentioned, 7 states outside of California signing legislation just this last year. I imagine that to accelerate more states in the future as well. And even those that perhaps currently are let's say, vetoed or so forth, I believe that attitude is going to change in the future. In New York, for new construction, this began at the end of last year. It's kind of nuanced here. It's for new construction, publicly funded projects, non-residential. So there's several caveats in there. Depending on the number of parking spaces, if it's 50 to 200 spaces, 10% of those must be EV ready. That's where I mentioned you have the panel, transformer, conduit, the wire running to it, it ends in a junction box or receptacle. And then if it's 200 or more than 200 parking spaces, it is 20% of those parking spaces must be EV ready. Also, I should mention here, there currently is legislation being proposed in New York that would increase these. It would take away some of these nuances where it would essentially be all non-residential buildings and perhaps multifamily, and it would increase these percentages. That's just being proposed now, and don't want to speak too much to it since it hasn't been passed, but just to call out, New York likely could be another state that increases these requirements through legislation this year. Moving on now to Illinois. Illinois is the state that has not yet adopted advanced clean cars, but is currently considering that, and there are robust dialogues going on around that. Their requirements are specifically for multifamily dwellings. So this is not yet for non-residential. And they have what they call small multifamily residence or large. Large meaning it is a multi-unit dwelling that can accommodate 5 families or more. So really anything that's let's say 4 apartment complexes, 4 apartment units or less would fall into the small category. Here in the small category, there needs to be at least 1 EV capable space for each residential unit that has dedicated parking. For the large residential, there needs to be essentially just 100% of the total spaces must be EV capable, whether it is dedicated to a specific unit or not. And again, reminding you that EV capable has the panel, transformer, conduit run, no wiring, no EV charger. But they are ready to go in the future that you can run the wiring and install the charger. Moving now to Maryland, which is another one of our states that has adopted the advanced clean cars. This is specifically for new multifamily dwellings. And the requirement is ratcheting up over time. It began October 1st of last year. And the requirements will increase in 2030 and again in 2035. First, each common space area must have at least 1 level 2 charger installed. And then for the rest of the common space parking spaces, as of now, 10% of those must be EV capable. And then in 2030, it goes up to 20%, then 2035, up to 30%. So each common area parking space will have at least 1 level 2 charger, and then those percentages will be ready in the future to retrofit as needed. Moving on now to Rhode Island, another one of the advanced clean car states. This requirement began January 1st of this year, and this is for new parking lots and for existing parking lots that expand, kind of dramatically expand the parking lot. If you add 50% or more new parking spaces, you would fall under this as well. You have to have what they call EV parking spaces. In there, they do not tell you exactly how much has to be a level 2 charger, EV capable or not. They say an EV parking space is defined as either EV charger is installed, EV ready, EV capable, DC fast charger. So they give you a menu of options to choose from, and you can choose according to your needs what you will do in there. And then it's according to these different number of parking spaces that you have, how many of those must be EV parking spaces. And then if it's over 200 parking spaces, it's just a flat 6% must be EV parking spaces. Moving on to Delaware, this is the last of the advanced clean car states that has adopted it. This is beginning next year, 2025, for all new multifamily dwellings. First, the common parking areas must have one EV charger installed, just like in Maryland, I believe it was. They must have a EV charger installed. And then in the common space area, 10% must be EV capable and 5% must have an actual EV charger. I think the reason they say the common space must have at least one is in the event that you have a really small parking lot. Let's say you have only 5 parking spaces in the common parking lot. No matter what size, you have to have at least one EV charger. As you get bigger parking spaces, 5% must have the EV charger, 10% must be EV capable. The last state I'll mention is Hawaii. They did not go as far as all the other states of saying what percentages and everything. Rather, their legislation was focused more towards public housing and public employees. So new public housing and buildings for public employees must be pre-wired to support level 2 chargers. So really that's the EV ready, where you have the wiring there, but the actual charger itself is not installed. You might have either a junction box or a receptacle. They don't specify which to have. Hawaii has not yet adopted the advanced clean cars or clean trucks rule. However, I would expect in the future to see them do that and to see them increase the percentages of requirements. I know that was a really quick run through of a lot of information. I think the biggest point I want to drive home is that just in 1 year, including California, 8 states have requirements by law that you must have EV chargers in new and sometimes retrofitted parking lots. This is expected to increase. EV chargers are going from nice to have to must have, and expected to see that a lot more. With that, I'll hand it back off to you, Raghav.
Great, thanks, Sean. And I know that was a lot of information, and I'll be super quick here to wrap up because I do see we only have a few questions in the chat room, and I want to make sure we have time for hopefully somewhat of a dialogue. But as John mentioned, EV charging is going from, to use this term, a nice to have to a must have. So perhaps it can feel a little bit daunting to sort of play catch up in a fairly rapid way. What I wanted to spend a minute here highlighting is that in the near term, there are incentives at both the federal and state level that are available to reduce the costs of your forthcoming EV charging project. I want to highlight this because I don't think these incentives are going to be around forever. I think what John just went through are these code changes that are essentially creating mandates for EV charging installation. Whenever you see EV charging mandates, or previously in California, you saw it on the solar side, you'll see incentives that are going to be available in the near term, but maybe not in the long term once the market transforms beyond a certain level. And once those mandates actually hit the books and it's code to install EV charging. So I want to encourage folks who are listening to take advantage of these incentives, essentially while they're still there over the next 2, 3, 4 years, because I anticipate they're not going to be around forever as EV charging goes, like John said, from a nice to have to a must have. But with that said, at the federal level, there's a couple things that came out of the recent bills that I'm sure you all heard about, the IRA and the BIL. In the IRA, and this is fairly hot off the presses because guidance was released just 3 weeks ago on the Section 30C EVSE tax credit. Now, this tax credit, which existed before but didn't get much traction, has been extended and expanded under the IRA to cover 30% of a charger cost up to $100,000 in the non-residential C&I space. And previously it covered the entire site, one tax credit for the entire site. They've since expanded that to include a tax credit for each and every charging installation. Now, there are a couple strings attached here. The first is that it's only applicable for non-urban and low-income census tracts, which could on the surface seem fairly limiting. But the industry has advocated for, and actually was successful in advocating for, a very inclusive map. So they released the IRS a map of what these non-urban and low-income census tracts were just a couple of weeks ago. And it did cover approximately 2/3 of the United States population. So much of the US is able to avail themselves of this Section 30C EVSE tax credit. That being said, given that it now applies to every single charger, there is significant clarity that is still needed around what constitutes a single item property. In other words, for the common area infrastructure that needs to be installed, from transformers to switchgear to service panels, there's still questions remaining around sort of how you apportion all of that equipment and the costs therein for a single tax credit for a charger. So we're waiting on guidance from the IRS on that we expect over the next couple of months. And as I was saying a moment ago, this extends through 2032. So, just an example of it's going to be around, but not forever. And the political winds are always churning. So I encourage you to take advantage of this and to reach out to PowerFlex if you have any questions about it. From the BIL, otherwise known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, President Biden's administration actually allocated $284 billion towards transportation, including $15 billion specific for EV infrastructure. And I won't go through these in the interest of time because I want to make sure that we do have time for questions. But two programs are sort of the tentpole programs on creating a national infrastructure corridor are the NEVI program, which is a formula funding program that's apportioned to states that's designed to strategically deploy EV charging infrastructure and essentially establish a network across this country of EV chargers along highways. And that goes directly to states on the basis of a certain formula that's sort of predetermined. And then there's a CFI program, the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Program, which is a more discretionary program that requires an actual application on the part of a number of entities. It could include a state, a Native American tribe, a local government, or a metropolitan planning organization as well. And these constitute $7.5 billion just between these two programs. And so again, I encourage you to look into these, especially if you're an entity that's in the public sector, interested in developing a EV charging installation. We're happy to answer any questions around these. One thing I do want to highlight around the NEVI and CFI programs and just the bipartisan infrastructure law in general is that they do establish prevailing wage requirements as well as what they call Buy America requirements. So it's indicative of not only are we seeing development on the codes and standards side as well as the goals and mandates side, we're seeing development on the compliance side as well. And we here at PowerFlex are paying very close attention to these rapidly evolving charger compliance requirements to make sure that the chargers that we're installing in a given jurisdiction are actually applicable to the local jurisdictional codes and laws. There's also 36 states that offer EV charging incentives, and I am absolutely not going to go through each one of these individually, but I do want to just make sure I draw your attention to the fact that the state in which you're looking to install your EV charging development will more likely than not offer an EV charging incentive that you can and should take advantage of. And as I said previously, we here at PowerFlex have a whole team that's dedicated to identifying incentives that will be applicable for your project, and we'll build all of that into the pricing at the time that we do a development. Another thing that I want to highlight on these charging incentives is some of these incentives are either specifically targeted towards or add incentive adders for projects that are either publicly accessible, are in the fleet space, or are located in a multi-unit dwelling, because these are target areas that they feel have been left behind and they're really trying to play catch up with. And then finally, just wrap up here in the last minute to just highlight how we at PowerFlex can be a resource for you. Obviously, on the policy side, John, our colleague Ayana, and I are always able to answer questions that you have on policy developments and how you can comply and navigate those and how we can help. As I mentioned earlier, we here at PowerFlex can also manage things in terms of the full stack development of an EV charging project for you. It's always advantageous to take advantage of the co-optimization of solar storage and EV charging. And that's a huge benefit that PowerFlex has, is that we do all of those resources in-house here, which actually reduces our ability to do that turnkey installation at a very low cost. One thing I did want to leave you with specific to PowerFlex that we're really proud of is our adaptive load management technology, which is our load management software. So what that does is it allows us to optimize and control the load that is being dispensed by the chargers behind the meter. And by doing so, and I'll switch forward here, you can see we can actually install more chargers, significantly more, 4 times as many, in fact, using the same amount of power and corresponding infrastructure that's necessary to install the chargers. And what that does is it speeds up the timeline for deployment, which has been a huge pain point. It also dramatically reduced the costs that are borne by the customer to avoid infrastructure costs that are necessary behind the meter to enable the project. PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric, which is the biggest electric utility in America, released a study based largely on PowerFlex installations, actually, that showed that using ALM can reduce customer costs by anywhere from $30,000 to $200,000 per site, depending on the site. And then finally, an important point, just so it's not all about customer costs, is that it also reduces costs for ratepayers. Because in addition to controlling the load, being able to sort of like control the customer costs behind the meter, there's significant costs the utilities undertake on their side of the meter that can be deferred by using ALM and controlling that load and sort of lowering the burden that's going to be put on the grid. In fact, the Public Advocates Office in California, which is the Ratepayer Advocates Office, suggested that between now and 2035, which is the time by which we want to be zero emission vehicles 100%, we can reduce the cost to electrifying the grid by roughly $26 billion by employing technologies that control load like ALM. So this is a huge advantage that PowerFlex has, and our ALM in particular is more granular and allows us to control each and every charger behind the meter in a way that will maximize value for both the customer, but also the grid. And so I'll leave it there just to say, please do reach out to us if you have any questions about the policies, or if you want to, speak more about forthcoming EV charging development. But with that, Annie, why don't we wrap up and we can kind of open it up to any Q&A.
Absolutely. So we got quite a few questions come through during your presentation. Excellent work, both John and Raghav. Thanks so much. These in particular came through while John was talking about the California incentives. And the first is in relation to new building development. Will those incentives only apply to new building development, or does this affect existing commercial building permits for new tenant improvements?
Yeah, great question. And looking through the questions, there's actually several I think I could answer, Annie, if that's all right.
Yeah, please. That's great. Thanks.
Yeah, so the solar carport is for existing parking lots. It's not just for new parking lots. New parking lots have their own requirements, but an existing parking lot that is putting in a solar carport will be subject to these requirements. There's a question also then, is the numbers, the percentages of 5-15%, is that for the entire parking lot or just those impacted or covered by the solar canopy? The way I understand it, it is just those covered by the solar carport, not the entire parking lot. There's another question then, kind of more nuanced. If you have multiple parking lots at a facility with solar installations on multiple parking lots, can you aggregate all of those EV parking spaces just in one area, or does it need to be under the solar canopies? That's a great question, and I don't have the best answer. I believe it would be under the solar canopies. However, the reason I cannot really speak to that with much authority is that this has not actually gone live. It does on July 1st. So I haven't, been able to communicate with our team who is doing this to see in those scenarios how it is done. So I'm sorry that I cannot speak more definitively to that, but I believe it is under the solar carports, at least is what I've been told by building officials. Couple of other questions. There were questions about the terminology of EV ready, EV capable, EV light. These definitions are pretty standard across states. So typically EV capable, or let's just start with a level 2 charger. They're almost always 208 or 240 volt with 40 amp. With the EV capable, the panel space, enough panel space to support 208, 240, 40 amp circuit. The EV ready is again the 208, 240 volt, 40 amp wiring and everything, ending in either a junction box or receptacle. Those definitions I have seen standard across all of these states that have adopted them. The one difference I've seen is Colorado with the EV capable light. That's the only state I've seen develop their own kind of definition that I haven't seen in other places. There were several questions about multifamily dwellings and installing new chargers. There's first one, if you want to do this voluntarily, if you're not doing major renovations and nothing is being triggered where you are required to install parking spaces, you just want to do that, you can do as many as you want to, no requirements there. The same person had a question though, of if you have limited capacity, I believe you said that your utility said you have limited capacity for what you might need or want to install. That's where what Raghav was talking about with automated, or our version of it, it's called adaptive load management, but kind of the industry's term for it, automated load management, is extremely helpful. You can install the number of chargers that you need, and per the building code, you are able to reduce the number of charging and even reduce the power capacity that is delivered at times to these chargers to fit that required number of parking spaces in with your existing infrastructure, meaning that you, in many scenarios, which I would say 99% of our cases, we have been able to do that where we oversubscribe, oversubscribe the amount of capacity for what the actual site could handle, and we're able to manage it within the existing infrastructure, essentially eliminating or reducing the added infrastructure that's needed there, and really eliminating the utility side infrastructure that is needed. There was a question here, Raghav, about the California Advanced Clean Fleets milestone. Would you want to take that on?
Sure, John, would you mind reading it for me since I'm
in California Advanced Clean Fleets milestone group 1, 10% zero emission vehicle by 2025. Is it end of 2025 or January 1st, 2025?
Yeah, that's a good question. I believe that is end of 2025, John, but allow me to confirm. I'll get the name of whoever asked that question and reach out to them immediately offline here.
Okay.
Great. I think that's unfortunately all of the time that we have today for questions. Again, I want to thank Raghav and John for their time. And thanks for all of the really engaging questions. We will be sending out an email with a recording and the presentation later today. You'll also be able to find the recording and presentation on the event center of our website. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, folks.